Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome. My name is Tony Marks, and I'm the president of the New York Public Library. I want to thank you for being with us, for those of you here, and for those of you joining us online. I'm pleased to welcome you for a very special conversation, a behind-the-scenes peek into how America's leading magazine, and I'm going to get into trouble for that surely, but I'll stick with it, America's leading magazine gets made. We're going to hear the secret sauce tonight. Our New York Public Library trustee and my friend David Remnick is here tonight to speak with some of his editorial colleagues for an insider's view into the New Yorker, how articles are assigned, crafted, and brought to life, from first pitch to final publication, and how the magazine reflects and builds on its storied past. He'll be joined by his amazing colleagues, editorial director Henry Finder, senior editor and podcast host Tyler Foggatt, articles editor Susan Morrison, and executive editor Daniel Zalewski. So now I should just say up front that I inherited an addiction to the New Yorker. And I am totally addicted. I look forward to it every week. My father was a complete addict. We lived in a relatively small apartment in Inwood, and I think half the closets were dedicated to his clipping service that he decided to do for his whole life of every article at the New Yorker, which is just amazing. I was sometimes jealous of the New Yorker in terms of how much attention he paid to it. But I understand now, because the New Yorker is, was, and remains the source of wisdom and insight and creativity and inspiration, even in these difficult days. It is like the New York Public Library in that regard. And of course, the connections continue. The New York Public Library currently is proud to host a major exhibition, A Century of the New Yorker, on view now, just a few stories above us, celebrating the magazine's 100th anniversary. It draws on our own collections because we house the archive of the New Yorker up to 1984 so far and counting, and includes the magazine's voluminous archives and the papers of many of its contributors to bring to life the people, stories, and ideas that have made the New Yorker. It's on view through February of next year, and everyone on tonight's panel contributed to its making. David was our principal advisor, of course, and even works from his own collection are in the show. But all of tonight's guests either advised on the show or helped to illuminate the magazine's history for our curators. It is really an amazing show. I urge you to see it on the third floor if you haven't yet. After tonight's program, if you have questions, our panelists will be happy to answer them, or at least pretend to answer them. And we'll have time for a few of those. You have note cards on your seats with little pencils. Staff will come around and collect your questions. And for those of you watching online, you can enter your questions in the chat. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. And of course, we couldn't do any of this, any of what we do, without all of you, without all of the millions of New Yorkers who love, cherish, and support their library. And of course, we are indebted to our Board of Trustees. I'm delighted tonight we have a member of the board in the audience, Columbia Dean and Trustee Jelani Cobb is with us tonight. And now, please join me in welcoming Henry Finder, Tyler Foggatt, Susan Morrison, Daniel Zalewski, and David Remnick.
Thank you, Tony Marks. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope some of you at least have gotten up to the third floor to see. Anybody gone to see this exhibition? Yeah? I mean, it has my personal laundry list. It's incredible. I'm delighted to be here with dear colleagues with whom I've worked for quite a long time. And Vladimir Nabokov was once asked how he thought up of the metaphor for such and such a moment in a novel. And he wrote back, because he never did these interviews in person generally, he did them by correspondence, and he wrote back, "Pure genius." The trick of an editor is to try to coax that genius into being if it's not there absolutely immediately. And sometimes the writer doesn't necessarily hit the first draft exactly the way possibly Nabokov would. And I want to begin by asking my colleague Henry Finder, who, when I asked him what we should talk about tonight, spoke in almost kind of medical terms. You said you get a manuscript and you run a series of diagnostics on it. What exactly do you mean?
Well, let me recall something else that Nabokov once said. He said, "I never show people copies of my rough drafts. It would be like passing around a sample of my sputum." But a professional writer, a magazine writer, must do that. And of course, you are then presented with a piece. And pieces go wrong in two broad ways. One of them is the piece doesn't know what it's about. And the first question you always have to ask is, what is this piece about? You may think you know because you assigned it on a particular topic. The piece itself may have another idea. So this is one incredibly important question that you cannot skip. The other way a piece goes wrong is by failing, it may know what it's about, but it fails to execute it in certain ways. A metaphor that I sometimes use is seeing a chessboard. One of the things that we do as editors is train the next generation in what it is that we do. And in that process, you may give it to an editorial assistant, and they'll correctly tell you 17 things that are wrong with the first section. When you're spending a lot of time saying what's wrong with something, you have probably taken a wrong turn. Because you want to say, that's all very good, but you need to understand we're not using that first section at all. That's not part of the piece. So you have to understand what in the piece is bearing weight, what is moving things forward, what is to be deepened and developed, what should just not be there at all. And these are fundamental questions that have to do with the kind of sequence or structure of a piece. I remember I was once given a piece. I think it arrived in the wee hours of the morning. I woke up groggily. It was profile. It was a wonderful writer, and it was actually his first profile. And it was 10,000 words, and I read it on my iPhone, actually, in bed, I must admit. And I just thumbed through it, and I believe that I spent 100 seconds going through it. And one thing that you get from experience is a sense of gestalt. And I should say I like getting back to people fast. And I told him, look, I spent 100 seconds on your piece. I think I know what's wrong with him.
Just what a writer wants to hear.
This needs to be scene-driven, and you've written a New York Review piece. This is all exposition. I can get on the phone, we can storyboard it, I can tell you what it needs to feel like. But that's something that you can actually literally see, because you're not seeing dialogue, you're not seeing establishing setups and so on. You can kind of almost see from the way that it fills the screen that something has gone really, really wrong. And I said, look, I will turn every page this afternoon, and if I'm wrong, okay. But this is what I think is wrong. And he said, oh, I think I see what you're saying. And then we did speak properly later on, and the revision that he delivered was superb. He had all the skills necessary. He's a wonderful, wonderful profile writer. It's just this mistake that everyone makes, which is you've read lots of profiles, and people always feel, I know how to write a profile because I've read hundreds of profiles. And my response to that is, I've been to a lot of piano recitals.
Susan, every Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we have a meeting, or a small bunch of us do. Sometimes it's a permanent cast, a small permanent bunch, and it's a rotating cast, and we even like to have, a fact checker or two come, or a copy editor, people who may normally not be in idea meetings. We want to get ideas wherever we can. Very often, people who are new to that process suggest what you and I would call a topic rather than ideas. What's the difference?
Well, first I'll say that one of the reasons that we have this meeting is not just to get the staff there, but it's a way to get writers in the building, and it's a way to get the young people on the staff to be in a room with David and see that he isn't scary, so they can be at a table with him and speak their mind. But, very often a rookie mistake is to just say, this is a broad, we should do something about climate change or something, rather than a specific story with a specific protagonist and a conflict and a beginning, middle, and end. And teaching people what the difference is one of the reasons that we have those meetings.
Henry just mentioned something sounding like a New York Review of Books piece. What distinguishes a New Yorker piece as opposed from an Atlantic piece or a piece in the New York Review or whatever?
Something that I think we've all experienced hiring writers from other publications in their first New Yorker piece, and maybe this is what Henry was talking about, is something happens to the prose that I sometimes call New Yorkeritis. We'll hire someone because they have a sort of a bright and sprightly tone, which is something we desperately need, particularly in these dreadful times. But because they're at the New Yorker, they suddenly feel that they have to write with a kind of a leaden seriousness. So we have to kind of shake that out of them. I mean, one of the things I do at the magazine, as you know, is edit the Talk of the Town section, and I hire a lot of young writers and develop them through these 800-word pieces. And the tone of those pieces is especially crucial. It's the gateway to the magazine. It's the first thing readers see. And there has to be, I think, a certain kind of jolliness to that. James Thurber really defined this tone, and he had a lot of wonderful ways of describing it to writers. He used to say a talk piece should be full of facts, but disdainful of facts. It should be limber. It should sound like my mother describing Einstein's theory of relativity on the crosstown bus. And Updike, whose prose, Henry edited him, I got to edit him once or twice. He had a great phrase to describe this kind of loose and limber and enjoyable tone, which was big town folksy. And I think that says so much. It's really important. And that, not just in the talk section, but it's the writing on the sentence level, the tone, the pleasure, that distinguishes what we do from a lot of our competitors, I'd say.
Dan, you are, as everybody is on the stage, remarkable in conceiving ideas with writers. And there's very often people ask us, where do the ideas come from? And the mythology used to be that the ideas only came from the writers. And then there's the mythology at other places that an imperial godhead, a single editor, from his or her, usually in the past, him, said intelligence would come, all ideas and all wisdom. In fact, it's a much more collaborative conversation. And you mentioned to me a particular moment with David Gran, a wonderful New Yorker writer who writes extraordinary books and to become movies, and his career is amazing. And I only wish that we'd have him more often, is the only thing about David Gran. That you had both read an article in the Times about an art connoisseur who had discovered an unknown Da Vinci drawing. You both saw this pretty minor clipping.
Yeah.
And then how did something come to be?
Well, in some ways, one thing you have to think about with ideas and writers at the New Yorker is that each staff writer is really kind of embarking on a kind of extended narrative with our readers, in which each piece kind of builds upon the other and creates a sense for you as a reader. Like, I know what a David Gran piece is, and for a while, a David Gran piece meant a piece with an incredible plot turn in the middle, in which you revealed that the person who you thought was a good guy was actually a killer, and then it actually maybe hung himself at the end. And it was kind of a form that he developed in which he would take material that had a bit of a tabloid feel, but then give it the full armature of reporting and narrative and turn it into his own. But that's kind of exhausting when you're doing, he was writing about prison gang kingpins and drug lords and all these sort of grifters and criminals. And so we saw this beautiful little story about this Da Vinci drawing, and we thought, oh, fine. Here's at last a little bagatelle piece we can write about this guy who's he's like a nerdy art historian and a genius who can look at an archive and find a little drawing, and he will be able to add to the canon. We just want to know how is it that are you a connoisseur? Do you need to use digital tools, or is it just your expert sophisticated eye? And so we both were like, oh, this will be a fun change of pace, something easy and fun for David Grann to do. And then, I'm like, oh, yeah, give him a call. He calls the man who lives in Canada, and 2 days later, he says, yeah, I talked to him for 90 minutes. Nothing that this guy has ever done is genuine. It's an empire of fraud. And it turned out that this Chipper Times clipping that was reporting that this Da Vinci drawing had been discovered was all part of the master plan of this man who, in fact, had a father who was a failed artist and had concocted a rather elaborate scheme of revenge on the art community who had not given him the respect he thought he deserved. And, what's fun about a story like that is you just realize, even when we think we know in a kind of sharp, we were like, oh, this is going to be a piece that's a piece for who really care about the details of art history, and we're really it's all gonna be about the Renaissance and how someone teleports back into the 16th century from you don't know, and you have to follow the reporting and be willing to redefine a piece as the discoveries unfurl. And that's one of the things I love about working at the New Yorker in particular. I used to work at the Times Magazine under a genius editor named Adam Moss, but he was definitely the kind of, he ran an editor's magazine in which he would come up with ideas and he wanted the writers to do exactly what was presented in the meeting. And at a place like the New Yorker, editors, we are seducers, we're interlocutors for the writers, but we don't divest them of power. We want them to take an idea, take energy that we give them, and pursue it in their own direction, sometimes arguing the exact opposite of something that I've originally conceived of. I mean, there was a story a few years ago that Larissa McFarker wrote about adoption, and I actually had pitched it to her as, I've been seeing on social media, there are all these young people who are perceiving that the act of adoption was actually a kind of act of trauma perpetrated upon them. And it seemed to me a little bit overwrought and even a kind of unfortunate product of digital discourse. And then Larissa, I'm sitting in a room imagining a story, which is part of the work, but then she goes out and reports and talks to men and women who have actually experienced severe emotional distress because of the effects of being adopted. And she wrote a piece about that. And she wrote a piece saying, take this seriously. When people actually say that adoption is a much more emotionally complicated process than just a gift that nice people do. She wrote that piece, and I'm really grateful that my kind of, little glib invention at the beginning of the process got completely overturned. That's one of the things that you learn as an editor, is to both be a kind of ringleader, but also kind of humble enough to let, a superior intelligence kind of take it in a fresh direction.
Tyler, you came to the New Yorker long after the New Yorker was the following. For many years, the New Yorker was 12, about a dozen pieces, some reviews, maybe a profile, a talk of the town section, some gag cartoons, a cover, and then we went home on Friday.
Sounds pretty nice.
Yes, it would be. And then at a certain point, this thing called the internet was invented. And I think it's fair to say that we weren't prepared, or we certainly didn't know how to embrace or deal with the velocity that the internet provides, even as readily as a newspaper, which had trouble enough. I mean, innovation reports and all kinds of tumult at the New York Times, when in fact a newspaper is a lot closer to the metabolism of the internet, certainly than the New Yorker. But you grew up on it. It's always been there. How do you, and you do a lot of editing for both, what do you look for pieces online as distinguished from longer pieces that are both online and in print?
Well, it's a few things. I mean, I think that our online pieces can sometimes be a little bit less scene-driven. Like, I think we do more commentary and analysis and criticism, although we do a lot of that in the print edition as well.
Sure.
But I think that there's a little bit less of an emphasis on, kind of the cinematic narrative that often drives our long-form print features. But I think it's a matter of being, responsive, but not, necessarily reactive. I mean, I think just on the subject of breaking news, because I oversee a lot of our breaking news coverage, I am really thankful that we do not work at a TMZ-like operation where, Hulk Hogan has died and everyone's like calling the hospital for confirmation of his death so that they can like be the first people to publish the fact that he is gone. Like, our readers aren't necessarily dependent on us to tell them that something has happened. They want to know what we think about the thing that has happened. And so that's a much more interesting exercise, even if it does put a little more pressure on us to say something smart after something big has happened.
Well, what's our role in the world of the news? I always figure that our readers read any number of things, but almost certainly some good newspaper or another, and that they're getting their sort of basic news and more from the New York Times or the Journal or whatever it might be that they're reading. What is, in terms of news, not the more eccentric things that we publish or the more intellectual things or things that are more extended, but in terms of news, the church of what's happening now and today and tomorrow, you edit something called the lead every day. You're in charge of making sure we have something there. That's no easy task. And it's a metabolism that not everybody at the New Yorker cottoned to easily in the beginning. What are you looking for there? And what are you not looking for?
So there's definitely, a desire to cover most major political events. Like, I think that if every single news organization is writing about something at one point, we sort of, we at least talk about whether we should be doing something too. So I think that sometimes, Donald Trump has been shot. Like, obviously, we need to do something. I think where it gets more interesting are the news events where it's like, do we actually need to write on this? Is this a story that is going to continue for a long period of time, or is this something that might pass? Which is, comes up a lot with like Trump's policies, where it's like this, tariff announcement might not even exist the following day. And so should we scramble to do a piece on that, or should we wait and kind of see how things settle? So I think it's a mix of kind of figuring out what is actually going to be important in the long term, which is a hard thing to do, but we do talk about it a lot. And then also thinking about cultural news. I mean, I think that is that's a big part of it too. It's not just like what's happening at the White House. It's like what people are thinking about and talking about. And I think that the premiere of a film that, has everyone talking is kind of just as important of a news event as like some of the other things on the website.
When you got to the New Yorker, you were how old?
I was just fresh out of college.
You had an internship at the Daily News, I think that was it. And you worked first for Daniel for a bit, and then with Susan at Talk of the Town. What did you, when you first arrived at the New Yorker, what was confusing or weird about it, and what did you feel that you learned pretty quickly that you didn't expect?
I mean, everything about it was weird and confusing. I mean, even
still is.
Even the titles, like when we're introduced as, articles editor, and it's like I couldn't even figure out like the organizational structure.
I have no way. I'm with you on that.
I thought that it was going to be a lot more relaxed, because even though it is a weekly magazine, it's still a magazine. It's not a daily. I mean, or it kind of is a daily now with the website, but like compared to the New York Daily News, where like, they were shouting at me to go to Rikers Island or something, like I did think it was going to be, a little bit slower paced, but like there is a lot of stress and kind of frenetic energy in the office, although it's good. I think the main thing is that I was just kind of intimidated by how smart and knowledgeable everyone was. And I still am intimidated by that, but I think that it really was, it was just like overhearing these conversations, and it was like people talking about books I had never read, and not only had they read the books, but they like had the most interesting takes on them you could imagine, and talking about like rival political factions in countries that I couldn't even pronounce the names of. And I think that what's been really heartening is that like you realize that a lot of that, the accumulation of knowledge that just comes from being an editor. You know, like a few years ago, I edited this piece on illegal South African gold mining, and now I know a lot about gold mining and the gold trade in South Africa that, like, I didn't know a few years ago. And so, even though I'm sure you guys were all brilliant before you started working here, I do think that some of what you know has come from just working on a broad range.
Every single thing I know about women's clothing, I know from editing fashion articles. I'm like, Rick Rack, I know that. A-line, I know that. You know, it's an amazing education.
Excuse me, Daniel. At one point, you were the perfume editor of the New Yorker, in addition to your many duties.
He's the resident nose.
Henry, is any writer, I mean, present company excluded, of course, perfect? In other words, John Updike used to send pieces, they would arrive chugging through the fax machine. Was that as close as it got?
An important thing in editing is knowing when not to edit. And if you get a piece that is just, as I say, markup copy, just immaculate, thought through, carefully designed, carefully worded. The one thing you don't want to do is be obnoxious and like move things, to make meaningless things, to be spraying Kilroy was here on someone's prose. You don't make a change that you cannot justify to the writer. You don't just change, I don't know, serious to stringent for no reason. You have to be able to justify anything you do. And with John, there was a great range. Some of his pieces were perfection, and sometimes, particularly with more ambitious pieces, he did, I don't know, 7, 8 drafts of a piece on late style. And, neither of us were entirely happy with the early drafts. And we'd have conversations. And it was bothering him as well. And we would try things a little bit differently and so on. And I think we ended up in a good place. But that was an instance where, as much of a line-by-line perfectionist as he wanted to do something that had a lot of ambition. And he was going to put in the work in revising it to make it the piece that he did want it to be. So yeah, I mean, look, there are categories of writers who are like brilliant but sloppy. Just, it's a little bit of dependency. They know that we'll tidy it up. There are writers who are 100% not sloppy. They take pride in being in precision carpentry. I appreciate that always. At the level of copy editing, there's always something. But they're both valuable writers.
Can I just interrupt for a second, too? Henry just reminded me of a wonderful story that our colleague Deborah Treisman tells sometimes. When she was working with Martin Amis in the beginning, she sent him back a manuscript with probably a couple of very judicious suggestions, and his response was just a very flat, "It's not a draft."
Well, Susan, what do you do? This is an interesting dynamic. At a newspaper, I grew up at a newspaper. There was a hierarchy. The editor said, you can't do that, we have to cut from the bottom, blah, 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 blah. And everything was going, the excuse for accepting this was hierarchy and speed. Mm-hmm. Now, we have some speed considerations sometimes, and sometimes we need to get a piece finished on Thursday and not Friday. We close on Fridays, by the way, the print magazine, and it has not been unknown for Virginia Cannon, for example, who edits Comment, to get a call on Saturday morning saying, "I've got some more changes," and it's already whirring through the printer in another state. But what do you do at the New Yorker with resistance from the writer? How does that negotiation take place?
Well,
Big subject.
I think maybe because I have a little bit of a newspaper background myself, and in talk pieces have very quick turnarounds. Very often they're assigned and written on Monday or Tuesday. Sometimes they're assigned and written on Friday, and they close that Friday. So I'm, that same day. So I'm always working very quickly, and I have over the years developed, real facility to cut things up, rewrite the lead, move things around, change things, send them to the writer saying, hope this is okay, let me know. And there are some writers who flip out at that, and
How do you handle the flip out?
well, I'll just say, we just don't have that much time. Tell me what, if there's something you'd want to, we don't have any more words than this. If there's something you'd like to take out and put back the same number of words, I sort of negotiate it. But to tell you the truth, the people who are most fussy about these things are beginners. Very young writers, especially people with their first couple of New Yorker pieces. The more professional, the more seasoned the writer, the more grateful and they are for editing and suggestions. I don't have, I was working with someone who was doing her first New Yorker piece about 6 months ago, and I sent back a very lightly edited piece.
This is a talk piece or something?
No, a piece of memoir. And I hate track changes. I don't know if you, I just think there's something violent and ugly about them. I hate doing that to a piece of writing. So I will usually just do my edits within the text. I guess some people still use a pencil and paper and you show that to the writer, but that's kind of a mess too. And David is the one who's always encouraging people, just read it clean. You don't want to read it with all the marks and carets and X's on it. So I sent this to this writer, and she was very upset. She really needed to see every change. So I went back to a clean galley, and I wrote them all on by hand. And it was obviously just a comfort level for this person. But that's unusual, I would say.
I have to make a confession. Henry Finder has been my editor when I write. And Henry, depending on the piece, can make a lot of or a certain amount of changes or suggestions. It's a process that often begins with maybe this lead should be either on the bottom or maybe nowhere or something like that. It's conceptual conversation. But when it gets down to it, sentence by sentence, Henry will send me back the piece in two forms. One with the track changes all over it, and one without it. And I have long since stopped looking at the track changes because if I have an objection, I should be able to have memorized it in a sense. I should be able to, see that he hasn't gotten it right, I got it right, or something like that. Daniel does a different thing. This is true confessions time, sorry. Daniel, and I trust him to the end of the earth, Daniel doesn't want me to see pieces until Daniel is damn ready to give it to me. And with some editors, that might be testing patience or deadline or otherwise. But I know that when I get this piece, usually on a Friday, and I go home with what's called weekend reading, that this is going to be really good. And it's set up in a certain typeface so that it's kind of particularly Zalewski-eyed. What has happened between when you get it, and you have a lot of good writers, what has happened so that when I get it, I'm so happy on Friday night?
Well, I was thinking when you were talking about sort of like how you deal with any writer resistance, my grand weapon is my garrulousness. Like, I'm willing to talk through every change and defend my position at every turn and kind of just almost convey to the writer that I've thought through this text almost, never as much, but almost as thoroughly as you have. And that is actually the kind of authority, is that I'm actually so in it with you. I'm so obsessed with the same text that you are that it's not an act of me like doing iconoclasm on your masterpiece. It's almost that I'm trying to be like a graphic equalizer on your piece of music and just trying to calibrate it just so that it's most beautiful. And I think that intent of knowing that you're you're argumentative and you have opinions, but that you want the best story possible is very heartening.
So you've gained credibility by commitment.
I think so. I think, and to the point of being a slightly exasperating opinion-filled editor, who has my opinions and wants my way.
What does a lousy editor look like? In other words, what is a bad editor doing?
Well, I think
typically.
Well, I think that a truly lazy editor is somebody who, in some ways is just thinking, will this get by the readers? Like, will this do what it needs to do on the internet? Not what is the actual most ideal version of this piece, and even if it requires going back to New Jersey and doing more reporting and doing something really awkward emotionally, but like I just try to imagine we have all the money in the world. We don't, but I present like we have all the money in the world. We can travel where we want to go. We can write it as long as we want if it deserves that. And I try to just treat everything with that level of kind of fascination and hope. And then you have to be, obviously you have to be realistic about how a reader follows a story and momentum and pacing and all these types of things. And I think what's great about working at The New Yorker and having David as the top is that, he's a writer. You're obviously the editor of the magazine, but you are a writer first and foremost. And so quite frankly, when I say I withhold text so that until you read it, it's like when a writer reads a piece, you read it with the same kind of genial competitiveness of another writer. And it's basically the David reaction is, I could do that. I could do it better. Or I'm really impressed, and it shows me something new as a writer that I want to steal or learn from, and I want to have you to have that latter reaction. So like I withhold until I feel that it's going to give you that pleasure quotient. And so sure, there's a lot of back and forth, but we both, the writer and I, both know that that's the goal, is to make you feel either delighted or moved or devastated, and we don't relinquish it until we feel like we've got it.
Henry, go ahead. I'm sorry. I want to just throw in two things there. One is obviously editing is two different things. It's the kind of the polishing, the prose work,
yes. And
editing is the kind of storyboarding that Daniel's talking about, which is something is missing, something needs to be different. I'm thinking of it as an unfolding story. We got lost in the journey. We need to fix that. And when you are in that process of honing, the trade secret is you tell the writer, you'll notice some streamlining and a few sequence adjustments and other adjustments. You tell them that you hope they'll be self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Because then the writer's like,
that's not really
oh
the
my
Daniel
God,
approach.
I should be able to figure out why that was done. But here's a second point. We could be wrong. You talk about writer resistance. The writer could be right. You need to listen to the writer. I remember early on, I was in my 20s, I'm starting out, and I'm editing a piece by Ian Parker. And I wanted him to do something.
Ian Parker is one of our master profile writer.
He's like a brilliant colorist. He's a wonderful profile writer. And he explained to me, rather seasoned writer, why he didn't want to do it, why it was a bad idea. And I thought, oh my God, you're right. And it actually influenced me. You learn from writers, from good writers, you learn from them. So it's not always the case that that all of our judgments are going to be impeccable. You also have to have open ears and be willing to reconsider.
I think that's actually the best aspect of being a New Yorker editor, is that half of the job is quietly struggling to be a worthy interlocutor with people who are better than you. And that is, like, it really makes you better. It makes you better when you are the forensic editor cleaning up the crime scene, because you've actually learned from somebody who is so gifted.
Tyler, and I'm going to ask Susan a similar question. You write for The New Yorker with some frequency. What's it like to be an editor who's getting edited when you know all the, or...
It's an incredibly humbling experience. I mean, I know that the piece is going to be so much better after it goes through the editing process, which is kind of an amazing thing, because I'll turn in something that I think is splendid, and it can just get so much better. I mean, I've had the pleasure of being edited by Susan, writing for Talk of the Town, and it's just amazing your ability to figure out, you know, how to say something that would take me 3 paragraphs, how to say it in, you know, 1 sentence. Just because in talk pieces, there can't be any fat on the piece. They're so short that they need to be, you just have to be very tight. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like you turn in the piece and then all of a sudden you get it back and it's like your jokes are funnier and all of a sudden your thoughts are clear. I'm just making myself sound like a terrible writer, but no, it's really...
Hardly that.
It's the best, yeah.
Susan, you just wrote a book about Lorne Michaels.
Very good.
It's a terrific book. Yes, indeed. And while we're advertising colleagues' books, Jelani Cobb's new book is fantastic. I have it right here. 3 or More is a Riot. So I got that ad in Jelani. You wrote this book early mornings, weekends, a teeny-weeny leave, and it's a considerable act of research, and with a subject about whom everybody around him tells stories, but the center of it is this Buddha-like figure who's immensely complicated. What was it like to write a book? You're not 22, it's not, and have this, and then go through editing process, all this stuff. It must be strange outside of the realm of your day-to-day New Yorker work.
It was incredibly strange, and I urge anyone to jump off a cliff like that when they're in their 50s. I mean, I have been an editor for 40 years and really hardly written anything, and so this 10-year effort, this book literally appeared the same week I applied for Medicare, which was incredible. But I worked really hard on it in my spare time.
They love that.
People do, but and Daniel here edited an excerpt of it for the New Yorker, and I was very nervous about this, having inflicted this on other people all these years. But I found, and he knows, I was jittery during it. It was sort of stressful, but mainly
because you're close friends and colleagues for a long time,
just because when you haven't, writing is exposure. I mean, and the idea of this thing, my dear departed friend Peter Kaplan always used to say, all biography is autobiography. Even when you're writing about someone else, you're showing yourself to the world. And that's something I had successfully avoided doing for 40 years. It was always someone else's name on the piece. So it was scary. I was going to go outside in my underwear, right? So Daniel was helping edit this piece, and aside from the jitters, it was so wonderful to feel the company of this other intelligence engaging in my manuscript, because writing is lonely. You're in a room alone with a computer and your piles of notes, and that was a warm bath. And even when I was nervous about some of the decisions he was making, it's just what he said right now. He said, "I've read your book twice." I mean, I could tell that the book was really, and it's a 600 and some page book, right? That it was really under his skin, that he really knew what he was talking about, and it made it very easy to trust him. But yeah, the pleasure of it was just feeling the engagement in your project and having someone to kind of share the ideas with. But yeah, it was weird. It was a weird experience, and I have to say that I do think it's changed the way I work with writers to some degree.
How so?
Just a little bit more empathy. I mean, not that I was ever sort of really a hard-ass editor, but as I said, I tend to work briskly and quickly. But
you said something to me, we had an email exchange last week that I found really interesting. And we were talking about a particular story idea and a particular writer for that story. Story idea seemed absolutely, I don't want to get into the details of it, absolutely interesting. The writer, at least to my knowledge, didn't seem like, there was a very light, in some ways, lighthearted, or you could see the comic possibilities of this piece. The writer, at least on first glance, is not somebody I would have associated with hilarity. And you said that, well, that'll come, and presumably in the editing. So an editor is doing what in that circumstance?
Well, I mean, as I said, that's what you pay me for. I mean, it's my particular background. I worked for years at Spy Magazine, where we took, copy written by 18-year-old interns and spun them through our magic spinning wheel and turned them into something delightful and fun. I mean, and then also as the editor of the New York Observer, I do the same kind of thing. So I feel like being presented, for me, when I'm looking at a piece and running the diagnostics, as Henry said, obviously you want to work with great writers. You want it to be John Updike or David Grann or Tyler, but sometimes it's just someone who happens to be able to fill the bucket the reporting bucket with really interesting stuff. And then what your job is to just sort of, you know, maybe you're rewriting it, maybe you're adding some filigree, you're bringing the ideas up, you're just making it brighter. I mean, thankfully, we don't have to do too much of that at the New Yorker because we have a lot of great writers. But that is what the job is sometimes, and that's what I was saying here. That if the material is there, I'm going to be able to bring it to life in a way that is going to be fun.
So Tyler, upstairs is this exhibition, and it's 100 years of the New Yorker, and there are yellowing letters from Harold Ross and William Shawn and more. All kinds of funny hijinks is portrayed, and curling cartoons are there. I think it's a fair bet that you will be at the New Yorker long after me, and possibly even some of these folks, but long may you all be there. And this is from the audience, how do you balance the traditions of the magazine with the need to evolve with the audience and the times? What do you want to see the New Yorker retain and maybe change, other than the diaeresis, which we kept? You know
David,
what I'm talking
nobody
about.
knows what that is.
No,
You may think of it as the umlaut
The
over
umlaut.
the O in cooperative.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I appreciate this very simple question from the audience. I mean, one thing I think about is just making sure that we, you know, in addition to adapting for the internet and everything, that we're also just reaching the, you know, like the next generation, like just making sure that young people continue to read The New Yorker or read it all. You know, they kind of go hand in hand. But I think, you know, it's the first New Yorker piece that I ever read, or where I was aware that I was reading The New Yorker, because I'm sure I encountered it before this, was Janet Malcolm's piece on Gossip Girl, which was so exciting to me as a young person, because it was like this very highbrow treatment of a lowbrow thing, and just sort of someone being just as interested in this book series and the show as I was, and not being condescending about it at all, but just sort of like judging this thing on the merits and saying what was good about it and what was interesting about it, and then, you know, what wasn't so good, and I happen to agree with the things that were bad. And I think that to the extent that we can continue to do that kind of work, and I think that we see, you know, writers like Nomi Fry and Doreen St. Felix and Gia Tolentino doing this a lot, but it's like really, you know, cultural criticism that isn't just like, this book came out, now I'm going to review it, but kind of speaking about things that are truly in the zeitgeist, but then also writing pieces that don't just, you know, only work 1 week and then 5 months later you're like, why did we cover this? This is so embarrassing.
And when that happens, you feel a sense of, we blew it? If it's that ephemeral?
Not necessarily that we blew it. I mean, I think it is kind of interesting to look through the archive and kind of see. I mean, we've been doing a lot of that with, you know, sort of celebrating our you know, our 100th anniversary, but just kind of like seeing the, you know, the assignments that were like a little wonky, and I mean, I think they're all teaching experiences.
Fair enough.
Let me just jump in.
Please.
Speaking of blowing it, I mean, you often say, if you look back at the New Yorker in the 1960s and 70s, like there were no articles about the Beatles. I mean, talk about that's the flip side of this, and we don't want to do that.
This is true, that that there was not, I would say, an overwhelming sense of urgency in time. And sometimes that could be charming. Roger Angel's World Series piece would often come out in March. And that was fine. I mean, really, that was fine. But the fact that you know, if there was a profile of Duke Ellington and it came when Duke Ellington was already 80, maybe less fine. And to try to be magazines exist in time, and for there not to be a profile of the Beatles, that's an instructive thing that tells us something about how to approach our jobs. Whereas there was a fantastic profile by Nat Hentoff early on about Bob Dylan. So that's a triumph. So, and that one thing that we have, though, with show business, and maybe you can speak to this, Daniel, is it was still possible for Roger Angel to hang out with Willie Mays until he got tired of Willie Mays. And Whitney Balliet could hang out with Count Basie till the cows came home, and these days, you ain't getting Beyonce for 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, one of the things that you can get nostalgic for when you look through the archives of the New Yorker is just that, you know, yeah, Willie Mays didn't have an Instagram and was able to communicate with his fans independently of the media. And so, you know, sometimes I want to publish the list of all of the, you know, powerful men and women and famous people who have, you know, declined to participate in a profile with us. And, you know, because people will think, you know, why haven't you written about Rihanna? I'm like, well, it's Rihanna's choice, you know, and you know, and there's all sorts of people, you know, who, you know, right now have a way of, you know, communicating with an audience in a way that, you know, is very much on their terms. And you can even see, you know, if you step outside my immediate needs as an editor, why at times that's a justified position. But, you know, for the reading experience, wouldn't it be great if we, you know, could loosen a little bit the walls that exist around powerful people nowadays?
But if we can't, in fairness, we can do what Tyler did with Tom Cruise, who either gives no interviews or they're really disingenuous and vacuous interviews. Yeah. And you wrote an amazing piece about Tom Cruise, which is a kind of either in the mode of an appreciation or right around, or if you get them really early, as with Taylor Swift, another enthusiasm, which the New Yorker was successful. I mean, we didn't get Xi Jinping either.
No. And a lot of what, you know, a magazine writer does sometimes when you are obsessed with a particular person is that you begin reporting the piece, and, you know, once you've called 100 people who know that person, the subject thinks, maybe I should call back, you know, because they're getting a kind of rounded portrait of me without me, and maybe I want to become part of that. So, like, yeah, we don't allow it to stop us, because if we did, you know, it would practically be a magazine that was silent on culture in an age in which people do really try to, you know, be their own brands and sort of make it through the public world without any friction.
Henry, what is the New Yorker voice?
Well, there's a plurality of voices. So one very characteristic kind of prime New Yorker thing is the scene and character-driven work of narrative journalism. So if you got hang time with Rihanna, you know, you would be able to produce a very special piece, because that kind of reported texture is something that we value immensely. And therefore, conversely, it raises the bar when you're doing a write-around, when you're just doing a cultural take. You need to have a very interesting way of framing it. And fortunately, often enough, we are able to hit that bar. So when Tyler has written about Taylor Swift, or the Luca Guadagnini film about the challengers, tennis players, so many people would buttonhole me to talk about what Tyler had written, because she framed it differently. She saw things no one else had seen. She found a completely distinct angle on it. That's so hard to do, and therefore we're so grateful when it happens. So one of the things that we try to do in the cultural zone is to just look at things a little bit differently. In an extended cultural essay, a critic at large, it's a story too. It could be James Wood writing about, you know, Elena Ferrante. There's a problem that he's solving, and he's going to, like, pull it through. This is a kind of a higher brow kind of engagement. You don't think of it as a story. It is a story. It's a mystery story. The only reason that you're keeping with it is you want to see how the mystery gets solved. And the pieces that we think of as essays work for us because they succeed as narrative. But I would say that narrative really is incredibly central to the New Yorker art. And the New Yorker voice, which is many voices, works best when it is able to kind of work with a kind of an armature that pulls you forward, that has a sense of suspense, that has a sense of a partial or complete resolution.
One thing that joins you, unites you, other than the place where we all work, is that all four of you are extraordinary in finding writers in this place, under that rock, and not always in the obvious places. It's not always, oh, this person's good in the New York Times Magazine or some of the dead obvious places. Where do you go looking, Susan?
Oh, I guess it's changed so much over the years. There used to be publications that you thought of as kind of little farm teams. I remember the American Lawyer was one. The New York Observer was one.
Where Connie Bruck and Jim Stewart came from.
Then there was this weird period of a decade when blogging started. And every young person was just writing about their feelings. And that was a terrible time because because there wasn't anybody out there reporting. There was a whole generation of people. You had to teach them how to pick up the phone and talk to another person and ask questions.
Much less leave the office and do so. I will say, Susan, when she interviews, often for her assistant, which is a real editorial job, she'll say, well, what do you read? And they'll say the New York Times and Telos Journal and the James Joyce Quarterly. And she'll say very gently, do you read the New York Post? And, oh, no, I don't read the New York Post. Forget it. They're not getting a job.
No, I want people who know what's going on and are curious on all levels. If somebody tells me they read the Paris Review and, you want people who are really engaged.
I'm just lucky that you didn't go to the New York Post. Yeah, I'm still worried about that happening.
Well, the Daily Mail is really the crown jewel. Okay.
Yeah.
But no,
I'm known to send Daily Mail clippings at 6 a.m. to people. Yeah. I'm very proud of it.
The thing that I'm always looking for, because we actually live in an age, where there's this word that I really dislike that kind of is very common in journalistic circles sometimes now to express what every editor is supposed to be looking for, which is this term voicey. And to me, it's sort of limiting because it always means kind of the same thing. It means somebody's basically imitating this, like the tone of Gawker, that old kind of vicious website that we all enjoyed reading at work. And but it's always like the same kind of tone of like a writer who's a little, like the persona of the writer is a little bit out of control and like a little bit, like had too much to drink last night and a real kind of urban, decadent, sophisticated. And it's like the same voice. And I look for people who feel a little bit out of time, like somebody where you're like, oh, this writer's kind of interestingly prim, reminds me of Barbara Pym or something. Or this person is like weirdly obsessive about facts in a way that's almost like a crazed lawyer. And you just sense something different. And like the thing I always try to encourage people is, write in the style that speaks to you the most, because when you're trying to sound fashionable, you end up sounding like absolutely everybody else. And there's like Susan will talk about this kind of allergy that magazine editors have, where you're like, everybody for a little while, like in 1994, everyone would tuck into pasta, at a restaurant, or they'd like walk in on their Louboutins instead of shoes, and like there are these phrases that like just become common currency, and you're looking for the person who like just isn't bothering with that and hears something on a different frequency. And so sometimes it can be almost very plain that is attractive because it's different. And so, to me, when you say like, what is a distinctive voice, it is that daringness to kind of step outside of what is kind of the mode of the day.
This makes me think of one of my very favorite descriptions of beautiful prose of the E.B. White style. And it's something that Tad Tompkins once quoted Joseph Mitchell, or Tad Tompkins once said about Joe Mitchell's writing, Calvin Trillin said this, that he managed to get all the marks of writing off of it. Yeah. All the mannerisms, all the showboaty stuff. And that, I think, is essential.
Tyler and Henry, because we're going to close, but Tyler and Henry, where do you look for new talent?
Other publications, increasingly Substack.
Really?
I think I think it's nice to read people who have expertise in something. I think Substack is really great for that. You have someone who's like very much in the crypto world, and it's like, I don't know anything about crypto and I kind of don't want to, but having someone who does and can provide that expertise, and then it's like I have confidence in myself to be able to shape up the actual writing. So at least you're getting something specific with that. And then I love reading college publications, like college literary magazines, college newspapers. I was a daily newspaper person in college, and like I think they're underrated.
Henry Finder.
Yeah, I would second both those things. Substacks are now places where you can. They can be troves, and once in a while, you read certain college publications and you'll find people. I found people from back in the day, from Slate, from N+1, from, we should actually give a shout out probably to Seth Lipsky's New York Sun, because he was a great talent scout, and a number of people who, would come
At the Forward, when he was at the Forward. Right, Philip Garevich.
Philip Garevich, among others, yeah.
Jeff Goldberg was there, a number of people.
The Four Columns Drift, there's various publications that may come and go. But Daniel made a really important point, that there's a phenomena that I think of by the statistician's term overfitting. And if you overfit to the zeitgeist, you read so much, like, 2019, when you publish in 2019, you just are stamped with the date and time in which you're writing. And there are other people who you could read them 20 years later, and you never feel it's dated. It wasn't perfectly on the zeitgeist at the moment, but it works wonderfully. It has a kind of quality of imperishability that you value. And so many people, I think of Nathan Heller, who was part of the snark generation, but not doing snark, and writing about Robert Haas and apple pie and whatever. This is Daniel's point. Precisely by being a little bit out of sync, it was a voice that was announcing its distinctiveness. And you look for that, particularly when it comes to critics. The prose has to have recreational value. It has to be pleasurable to read for itself. If I'm reading someone who's breaking a big news story, and reporting is the big crisis we have right now because of the collapse of local news. But if I can have serviceable prose if it's important. But if I'm reading something that's not important, not in a worldly way, the prose is so all-important. And it has to be beautiful, it has to sing, it has to amuse me, it has to engage me, whatever it does. That prose has to work on a level that is so demanding. And when you see it, you often see it in the very first sentence of a piece. And you're gripped by it, and you just want more of that.
Henry Finder, Daniel Zalewski, Tyler Foggatt, Susan Morrison, thank you, and thank you all.